When we hear spiritual and ritual abuse, many of us picture far off places or large, isolated cults. But SARA happens right here in the US, across all backgrounds, in homes that may look unremarkable from the outside. Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
Hello, I'm Sarah Jack, and we are so excited to have a guest host with us today.
And you all remember me from Minute with Mary Bingham, and I am one of the directors of End Witch Hunts, and I study and research witch hunts from 300 years ago all the way up through the cases that are going on, especially with regards to spiritual and ritual abuse today. And you can hear those stories on my Sarah Wiles YouTube channel, both past and present cases. Thank you.
Spiritual and ritual abuse, SARA, and harmful traditional practices are overlapping categories of violence justified by belief systems. The National Working Group on Spiritual and Ritual Abuse in the UK defines SARA as abuse where the offender uses spiritual, superstitious, or traditional beliefs to justify harming others, such as believing a child is possessed or a witch, or uses the victim's own beliefs to manipulate and control them.
On a global scale, the United Nations uses the terminology harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks to categorize these human rights violations, which include physical violence, torture, displacement, and murder. These practices are reported in at least 60 nations and affect hundreds of thousands of individuals annually, particularly children and vulnerable adults.
In Western contexts, like the UK and the US, SARA often manifests as a mechanism of coercive control within domestic abuse, forced marriage, and human trafficking.
Traffickers may use the guise of spiritual practices, such as witchcraft rituals, to psychologically bind victims to them through the victim's own beliefs and fear, preventing escape without the need for physical restraints.
Abuse often occurs under the guise of deliverance or exorcism. In the UK and US, there have been fatal cases where children were beaten, starved, or tortured because caregivers believed they were possessed by demons or evil spirits.
Abusers may believe a victim is evil or a witch and justify sexual or physical abuse, or force them into marriage as a way to remove evil from a family or a person or an object. And you may be very familiar with cult, true crimes. Many survivors have come forward and they're telling their stories. Today, we're going to talk more specifically about victims that aren't able to tell their stories, but I want to start with just two cases that may be familiar to our listeners because they've received a lot of documentary attention, and they fall under this category of spiritual and ritual abuse. The first one is the case of Elizabeth Smart. She very recently talked about her experience on a documentary that's on Netflix. And she was a teen that was abducted from her Utah home in 2002. She was held by Brian David Mitchell, who claimed divine revelation, and he forced her into a spiritual marriage and repeatedly assaulted her as his wife and spiritual wife. She was too young to give consent. This specific case that you're probably familiar with shows how spiritual authority can be weaponized to justify and perpetuate abuse. And he cloaked her literally with her clothes, but it was a smoke screen, and he had her in public, hidden. He was using religious freedom to keep authorities from uncovering the crime. You may know there was a moment where an investigator tried to approach them and determine if this was her, but this guise was used to keep him from identifying her. Her case got massive media attention, but the spiritual element was often treated as secondary to the kidnapping.
Use of religion as a smokescreen and deflection to draw attention away from you is very common in these SARA cases that we'll go through today. People try to use religious freedom. They try to use that First Amendment to keep authorities from looking, and they also use it to justify their actions, both to themselves and to others that might question them. It's all, I was doing it for my religion. I was doing it. This is the way I was taught to do things. This is what I really believe. And well, we can't use belief as an excuse to do horrible things like this. If everybody uses religion as an excuse for why they did wrong things, it breaks the judicial system down.
So Elizabeth Smart probably isn't the only SARA case that you're familiar with. Have you considered that the recent case of Ruby Frank and Jody Hildebrandt is also a SARA case? This happened in an affluent community in Utah. We didn't pick on Utah today. These are just two very popular cases because there's been lots of shock and media coverage around the experiences of these children. Jody is quoted as saying, "I love children. I love your children. I have a sacred charge to help protect them. It's all the devil. He uses these kids. He uses all of us as the adults, the parents that don't hold the kids accountable." Those are very extreme comments, but those are indicators of her ideology. And when she paired up with the parenting influencer Ruby Frank, two children became victims of this ideology and suffered. When a child escaped, he was found to be brainwashed. He thought he was bad and going to go to jail. He was malnourished. He was emaciated, and he had wounds on his body. You might have watched the most recent documentary called Evil Influencer. Those investigators were shocked. We need to stop being shocked that this is happening because it's not new. And there's lots of cases. Mary may speak on that a little bit today. We've been tracking that, and she has reported lots of cases on her YouTube channel. In Ruby and Jody's case, they framed this as a necessary spiritual cleansing and moral correction. And as you're going to learn by looking at these crimes that are at our fingertips, reported in the media, there is no specific church affiliation required. It's a personal belief that leads us down this dangerous road, and it's scary.
Yeah, anyone can have these beliefs. They can come from any source, and anybody can hold them, any part of the country, it doesn't matter what background you have, your race, ethnicity, country of origin. People from all over the place do this kind of thing, and people from all different faiths and backgrounds and no faith at all do this kind of thing. It's very shocking every time it happens. I know people use that word. I was shocked that this happened, but we've documented several dozen cases through the In Spiritual and Ritual Abuse Project, through the End Witch Hunts organization. And we've seen that what really influences these activities, these violent excesses and abuses, are fear and panic. People do sometimes really believe that someone is diabolical. They're either a witch or they're possessed by an evil spirit, and that causes real fear in people. So they react to that in ways that are really, frankly, the real scary part is the reaction that happens to these situations. There's a lot of dehumanization through this process. It starts with demonization. You're saying that somebody is a witch, they're working for the devil, or that they're possessed by the devil or possessed by one of the devil's servants. And so you're literally calling somebody a demon. And once you do that, you think of them as less than human or not human at all, and find yourself involved in these sort of abuses based on your belief that you're not fighting a human, you're fighting evil itself.
When we look at these cases, you mentioned there's dozens that we've been collecting. Have you guys seen any factor that sticks out across the cases, like it's always this? Or what are we finding when we look at these cases? Are we finding any patterns? I think we're not finding patterns. I
don't think so
think
either.
yeah, I mean, the pattern is that there's a vulnerable victim, and the vulnerability sometimes is played out in different ways.
Yeah. The vulnerability, it can be because they're a child, they could be an older person, they could have a disability. There's so many reasons that a person might be susceptible to this type of treatment because somebody's just physically more powerful than them, or they're psychologically put in a position where they really believe that this person has some power over them through maybe casting of a curse. They believe that this person has cast a curse, that if they violate a rule, then they're going to get punished. It's going to be like karma. As soon as they break a rule, then the universe is going to strike at them because the curse is going to work. But other than that, I don't see patterns with demographics, with it's all ages, and the perpetrators are a very diverse group
Across the nation in different states. And I bring this up, Mary, and I'll hand the baton over to you because I know you have a very special little girl to talk to us about. When we talk to you today, it's going to become evident that this case is considering whether Arely's case is a part of systemic bias. Is her experience so unique? So I wanted to just bring up to keep that in mind while we're talking about her, that maybe what we're hearing about her story, it's her particular experience, but is it all that uncommon and unique?
That's a great question. And the other thing I'd like to just reiterate on before I go to Arely is I think the perpetrators have a very diverse situations in these cases that I've studied because a lot of them suffer from mental health issues, very sadly. Some of them have accused people through psychotic episodes due to overuse of drugs. And then there are other reasons too. So there's many, many reasons why people, it's hard to say. I'm making it sound so simple, but it's not. But there are many reasons why people accuse today.
I watched that documentary Evil Influencer about Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke, and some people adult they didn't have any of those situations going on. You don't even need, I know a lot of it has to do with mental health. Many of the
Yes.
cases have to do with mental health, absolutely. But there's also cases of just people who seem to think rationally otherwise doing these actions because of beliefs that they hold in their hearts and their
Extreme,
minds.
right. Extreme beliefs. Mental health plays a role, psychosis due to a drug, and also the fact that people just have these extreme beliefs that they live with every single day.
In Jodi Hildebrandt's case, she believed it was important, as you quoted from her, she talked about parents that don't hold the kids accountable. And you look in this documentary at the ways in which Jodi decided to hold kids accountable. It's any reasonable person would say that's not reasonable, but it doesn't imply that she had a mental health situation going on. I just mean that she just had this really strong belief that children were used by the devil and you had to fight back against that. And that really led her down this horrible road where this child had such wounds on his body. And there were other children.
The case of Arely Procter was the first case that I looked into when End Witch Hunts decided to research spiritual and ritual abuse cases. as the important part of its organization that continues to grow to this day. It was the first case that came up in the Google search, and it was the first case for which we collected data, and the first case for which we sought ongoing outside legal education. Our goal is to thoroughly research and speak on modern spiritual and ritual abuse cases as they happen today, expose existing elements of historical witch hunts in these modern cases where accusations of witchcraft, demonic possession, and so-called spiritual deliverance continue to cause harm, often leading to death. An example of this advocacy is my first article published to the Uncommon Ground Media in early of 2025. And that was the case of Arely Procter. And it's called Witch Hunting from Salem to San Jose, Dorothy Good and Arely Procter. And it compared the cases of Arely Procter, the 3-year-old who was believed to be possessed and died during a quote unquote exorcism at San Jose, California in 2021, to the case of Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old who was accused of bewitchment at Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. So, a background on the case of Arely was that in September of 2021, what happened was Arely's mother, Claudia Hernandez, and Arely's uncle, Rene Hernandez Santos, they all went out to dinner and they came home. And all of a sudden, Arely started to act erratically, and she began to do things that her mother believed were not normal for her. For example, she became very agitated. So her mother put her into the shower after Arely had decided that she was going to take all the clothes in her closet and just like toss them out onto the floor because she was looking for a shirt or something like that. But that was not like Arely to do something like that. So Claudia put her in the shower, got her cleaned up, put her into bed. And what's interesting is the sleeping arrangement was that Arely slept in between her mother and her uncle in the same bed. So that's kind of an interesting scenario for me as I was looking into this case. But then Arely was falling asleep, and she was falling asleep really fast. And then she would have some type of a nightmare, is what was described. She'd wake up screaming and raising her arms, like reaching out for something. And then she'd ask for milk at one time, and her mother brought her milk. And then all of a sudden, Arely said, "No, I don't want the milk anymore." But they didn't do anything to really help her. So they would calm her down. But instead of calling for medical attention, they decided that the girl needed to have a prayer service. They believed that she was possessed by some type of a demon. So they started to perform these prayer services, which actually, in my opinion, from reading the police reports, were violent exorcisms. They would basically wrap her body. They would put her parallel to the floor. They would put a trash can under her because they wanted her to vomit out this demon that was inside of her. They did that throughout the course of the night. And then when they realized early the next morning that it wasn't working at the house, they took her to Claudia's father's church. And they tried that quote unquote prayer service there. And they were harming her so.
Arely stayed upset and was unconsolable. Is that why they continued?
Yeah, well, that's why they continued, in between consoling her and noticing, weirdly so for them, that when they consoled her, that she would quiet down. Well, that was really working for her. So I don't understand why they decided that they were going to continue with this prayer service. So as they were not able to console her at home, or not able to help her at home for whatever reason, they took her to the church and continued there. And then I think it was later in the morning, they called Claudia's father, who was the pastor at that church. And he said, okay, well, I'll come after my lunch and I'll help you. But instead of helping the girl, when he could have intervened, he decided to enter into the prayer service, and the whole cycle continued. They would wrap her body under parallel, put their fingers down her throat, try to get her to vomit out the demon. And she was fighting so hard for her life. She was biting them. She was scratching, doing all those things to help get herself free. But the sad thing is that in between that, she would look at her mother at least once and say, I love you. But the violence just kept on going until finally, I think it was at 6:00 p.m. when Arely succumbed to her injuries. And what's also very strange for the rest of us that have read about this case is that after she died, supposedly Claudia didn't know whether or not she was dead. So she wound up calling family and friends first. And then her father told her to call the authorities. And that's when the EMTs arrived and they tried life-saving measures, and they couldn't save her life.
I do want to discuss with you the extent of her injuries. She had extensive injuries, like all throughout her body, that showed multiple forms of abuse took place.
Her blood vessels in her face burst.
Oh,
She had asphyxiation because they were holding her so tight. And when they were standing and they were switching positions, especially at the church, they would do that by holding her over the trash can with her legs lifted. Poor little thing. But they were holding her so tight and they were trying to keep her head still, but they were doing it very forcefully to cause all of those injuries. And she was bleeding on the inside too, from how I understand it. She had injuries all over her body. And the fact that she was passing out too, in between times, because they did say that at certain times during these prayer services that she did become unresponsive.
Josh, this really speaks to when you were talking about our and SARA project, the dehumanization and the demonization that happens at this point. It's almost like it's not a sweet little fragile child that they're to take care of. They've gone into this exorcism mode.
Their belief is, from how I understand it, that they're attacking the demon within Arely and not Arely herself. Even though she's the one that is experiencing all of this horrific abuse, ultimately dying at the end.
I saw in a YouTube video by Law and Crime that in a filing that we're going to talk about in a minute, the grandfather said that they had witnessed an exorcism or been part of an exorcism somewhere else where somebody vomited out or they pulled out a 12 to 18 inch crocodile out of somebody, reportedly in their own court filing.
Yes,
so
that was.
Is that what they were trying to do with Arely, do you think?
I wonder, because you're right, that was Rene Sr., the grandfather, who took part in it. And he was like one of many in that particular prayer service. I think it was in El Salvador, but I would encourage the listeners to go and listen to that video and they can hear it for themselves, what that particular instance was.
It's legal commentary, whereas we're not giving legal commentary, but we are experts in collecting these cases and in witchcraft accusations past and present. That discussion is a legal analysis of what's happening with the court case. Before we move forward to the court case and the defense, Mary, when we started collecting these cases, we were expecting to see this SARA label or identification on these cases, and we were finding that there were all these cases that would fall under this umbrella of SARA, but it wasn't necessarily recognized. And do you want to talk a little bit about how we learned to look at what's happening in the US and where we got our first legal input?
I will mention her name. She is a customer of mine where I work, and her name is Linda Delanis, and she is a retired New Hampshire State Supreme Court Justice. And when we started looking at these cases and trying to understand some of that legal process, particularly in the case of Arely, was kind enough to meet with us and talk with us about motivation. I believe what she was telling us in the US that motivation in a case is not brought up until after the arrest and when they enter the courtroom. So that's why in the US right now, you can accuse somebody of being a witch, and that's not considered illegal. But they can use that in the motivational aspects when they start the case inside the courtroom.
Yeah, and what we discovered was that it's really according to jurisdiction, county, state. Every case is going to have different charges. And what we're seeing, and what we're going to talk about now, is the defense of the charges that Claudia and the Renees are facing. The legal minds are looking at this because this is a defense that's not used a lot.
When the two Renees and Claudia were originally arrested, they were charged with assault causing the death of a child. And so it went through
murder. It was a murder.
Yeah, they were charged with that.
I just wanted to, I wasn't trying to interrupt you. It was more like,
yeah, so I actually was just using the exact legal case that they are legally, so to speak.
Yes,
so
you should. Yeah.
But you're right. It was murder. They killed her. And so sad. And it did get caught up in the case. So we kept on seeing and following on the cases of media interest for the Santa Clara County District's Attorney's Office, that it was like, okay, the next hearing. And when I would look up what the next hearing was for, it was always to set a trial date. And then it seemed that at some point, some of the lawyers for the defense may have changed. And the current defense attorneys are seeking to get the case of their three clients dismissed after we were seeing that the judge was getting ready to set the trial date and all this other stuff. And so it's not set yet because of those attorneys for those three clients. And they're seeking to get the case dismissed based on the Racial Justice Act of 2020, which was put into place in California so that racial, ethnic, or national origin does not influence investigations intentionally or unintentionally. These attorneys are claiming, it seems, that the early police interviews implied as such when they described the church where the grandfather was the pastor was a quote-unquote makeshift church, among a couple of other phrases that was used.
That really struck a chord with us, too, because when we started researching this a couple of years ago, we were like, oh, what are we going to find? Which faiths are doing this? Which organized churches are doing these kind of crimes? We now can see that it can happen anywhere. There's not an identifier when it comes to a denomination. But we were like, oh, this is happening outside of a formal exorcism process.
Exactly.
That's what that makeshift told us then. That's how we perceived it.
And was called by somebody a makeshift church because it's a church that's in a private residence. It's in a residential home.
Right.
A single family house.
Yes.
Which isn't uncommon. Yeah, it's not uncommon for people to have religious services in private homes.
Defendants have really expressed how central what they were doing is to their faith, a faith that has traditional origins. It goes back to their community of origin. So they are feeling that they experience persecution, religious persecution based on that. So makeshift makes it sound, even though to me that I don't see, it doesn't matter. Arely suffered something horrible. It doesn't matter why they were doing this to her, in my opinion.
That's right.
But it matters to them because they feel that their traditions and their spiritual beliefs are a valid reason.
It's interesting to me they're using this Racial Justice Act to, it seems like, claim religious discrimination when they're not really making in their filing. I don't think they make a strong case that their religion and the place of origin are like tied together in some way. Mm-hmm. They just say that they were insulting our faith. So I don't understand how they're even using the Racial Justice Act. But either way, you can't use religion as a defense for murder.
It was really the grandfather that was the one that was practicing and running the church on a weekly basis or however often they met with the congregation, because Claudia herself said that she had not attended services since 2016 and that she had only recently gone back to pray, but not to service, just to go sit and pray whenever she felt the need. I think the police reports say that she had just started on a daily basis, but it was like 2 or 3 weeks before this exorcism that took Arely's life. And Renee Jr. was also slowly coming back into his father's faith, so to speak. And he said that he had actually been a part of 2 exorcisms, but never one with a child. So this was a first for him. And so if they wanted to use the Racial Justice Act, maybe the defense would win with the grandfather and they would have to negotiate with him. But I don't think they can get away with it with Claudia and Renee Jr. Personally speaking, I'm not a lawyer. I've never pretended to play one. But looking at this case, it's like it doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense, especially with Claudia and Renee Jr. So that's just my finding on that.
Is there any indication in any of the reports about what motivated Claudia to go to the church to pray? Was she praying for Arely, or was there a specific reason she went to pray all of a sudden?
Well, she says in a third interview that she called for 2 or 3 weeks after the first police interviews, that she instigated this one. She said that she knew that God was going to take Arely's life. I don't know how much of this she is believing what she's saying, or is she just trying to backpedal and basically save herself from a life sentence? I don't know, but that's an excellent question.
Because to me, that sounds like premeditation, like she knew that the child was going to die and then she killed the child.
It does.
It does.
It also could, in a way, it fits the script of mothers. There were 2 in the US on the 31st of December of this past year, and then on the 1st of this year, 2 different mothers who took the lives of their toddlers like this. One strangled, one shot, and the one that shot her baby, it was I'm sending this child to heaven. It needs to go to heaven. This is an evil place type situation. I think we're all kind of familiar with that narrative where a parent, an alleged perpetrator, decides that something spiritual and physical is going to be happening with this child. That just does, it sounds too familiar.
Sarah, that is a great point, because when we talked earlier about when we started this, we thought that, these cases were going to be fairly cut and dry. And little did we know that now all of these cases that are coming in, even though they're very different in some ways, they all do fall under that umbrella of spiritual and ritual abuse.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there's a lot of video out there of Claudia talking. And when you listen to her, doesn't it, and you've read the reports and the statements, but it almost comes across like it's an acceptable sacrifice. Like, they didn't use the word sacrifice, but almost like, well, this was her destiny. This was her spiritual destiny. This happened to her. And that they were willing to lose her instead of protect this child's life. That's what I see surfacing in this case.
And the other important thing, too, especially for the legal part of this case, for the prosecution, is that when the police asked Claudia if she feels like that she caused Arely to die, in the first phase of the interviews, Claudia said, and I quote, "in a way." So hopefully the prosecution can really put that forth in a very loud way, so to speak, so that plays a really strong part against her and the defense team.
We're very much for the protections of the Racial Justice Act. That's an important piece of legislation. The protections that fall under that are critical.
Exactly.
But we feel that the SARA cases, the legal action, the justice that is, it's also murky. And what happens if this act is used to dismiss Arely's case?
I think it has, profound consequences because, we're 3 people doing this research project into SARA in the United States, and we've already come up with over 100 cases of this happening, this kind of thing. It largely been focused on exorcisms, but we know that there's so much more happening that's just the tip of the iceberg, those cases that we've studied so far, that if you could start using religion to justify criminal behavior, especially violence towards others, it really opens this huge can of worms. Like, what could people get away with if that were the case, that religion could justify the violent abuse of a child? Then it could justify about anything.
Exactly, because the law is in place to protect the rights of, in these cases, the children.
Children are the most vulnerable of our society, of our world. They learn from us. They survive because of adults and because we take care of them. If we aren't protecting them from spiritual abuse, we aren't protecting them. We're leaving them open to murder, to being murdered.
Exactly. And that's why the work of our organization and many organizations around the world that are so active and spreading the word and writing and talking about this. It's so important because that education will help save a life or many lives. So that's why it's so important. And Arely is important because her case is out there right now. There are other podcast episodes that are talking about her, at least in the past 3 years. This Law and Crime Network on YouTube is talking about it. And it's amazing. We have to keep that going forward and keep her case out front so that somebody else or another innocent child or a vulnerable person doesn't die.
Yeah, it's really important for adults that are in safeguarding positions to be bold, have courage, and speak up when a child is in a situation that's not okay. If you have any inclination, you need to speak up for that child. There are children dying around us. They're not always these children who are passing away because of parental abuse. It's not always SARA. There unfortunately was a 2-year-old who just passed here in the Denver area now, and it isn't showing any signs of spiritual and ritual abuse, but it's so hard for me to believe that there wasn't an adult seeing something wasn't okay. And there was also another case just recently in California, a very high profile church is connected to this family who killed, and there were volunteers in this family at the police station, and one was a church leader. So there's people around. If you see that a child isn't safe, you need to protect them.
I know, we all want to be sensitive to other people's religious feelings and beliefs and appreciate the variety of beliefs that people hold. But we can't let fear of offending somebody's religious feelings stop us from investigating a case of child abuse.
Exactly.
I really hope people listen to the video that we were speaking of by Law and Crime. Their legal commentator really weighs belief and ritual when it is something an adult can choose and they're mature and they understand the choices they're making, that's one thing. But when it's imposed on a child and it affects their health, are we recognizing that as abuse?
Yeah, she's by no means able to consent to an exorcism. So the legal point is whether adults can consent to exorcisms and what can people actually do in an exorcism. Just because you consent to have somebody pray over you is one thing. Consenting to have them, physically abuse you
Right.
is quite different matters.
So there was a hearing on the 29th of January and
2026.
2026. Thank you. And the results of that hearing have not been published yet. So when I called the courthouse, they told me that they can't give results over the phone, but I have ordered the documents. And once we know what happened on the 29th, we can in turn let the listeners know what happened. And
Thank you.
hopefully the trial will go forward. And there are a lot of people in the comments on these videos about Arely's case saying that they want the trial televised. So maybe that will happen, but who knows at this point.
Yeah, it's getting more and more attention from the media. So more likely that they would go that route, I think. But
yes.
Spiritual and ritual abuse in the American context refers to harmful acts justified by religious, spiritual, or ideological beliefs, like these cases that we've discussed today, and more. We are finding that SARA appears to be a hidden crisis within the United States, but it's occurring in families, homes, institutions, church, schools, and other religious communities. In the US, it manifests as violent exorcisms, the attempted expulsion of perceived evil spirits or demons from children, or vulnerable adults. We've seen exorcism murder on adults in the US recently. It uses spiritual authority to exploit, isolate, or control individuals who have no control over the situation. And it often involves labeling children as possessed or evil, and they justify this physical and emotional abuse that way.
And SARA matters in the United States of America. The United Kingdom has a national working group. We mentioned the National Working Group on Spiritual and Ritual Abuse. The United States currently has no central system for monitoring this type of abuse. Organizations like End Witch Hunts have begun tracking cases to create foundational data because these crimes often they do fly under the radar, or they're prosecuted as standard child abuse without any acknowledgement that there's belief systems driving them. And fatal consequences are occurring now to this type of behavior, these abuses. We've seen people die in a number of awful ways because of these things. SARA matters in the United States because the underlying beliefs are more prevalent than assumed. Research by economist Boris Gershman indicates that approximately 1 in 6 Americans believe in the evil eye or the ability to cast curses, meaning these fears exist within many social circles. This isn't limited to any particular group or faith. You don't even have to follow a particular faith to believe in the evil eye and evil magic. Furthermore, SARA links to broader American cultural phenomena like the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and the modern QAnon conspiracies, which rely on unfalsifiable claims about satanic conspiracy to demonize perceived enemies.
Acknowledging spiritual and ritual abuse in the United States is essential because, as advocates note, when America recognizes its own history of witch trials, such as the recent exonerations in Connecticut and the efforts ongoing in Massachusetts, it sends a powerful signal to the world that these harmful practices are unacceptable violations of human rights.
Mary, thank you so much for all the data collecting you've done and for your victim and case short videos that you do on YouTube. How do our listeners watch those?
They can go directly to my YouTube channel, which is Sarah Wilds 1692. And there is a playlist called World Day to End Witch Hunts 2025.
Oh, yes, because your project for World Day Against Witch Hunts, which is August 10th every year, was to highlight these stories. That was an amazing effort.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for helping us discuss this important message and talk about the crisis of SARA. We're really grateful that you came on the podcast to discuss this with us today.
Thank you. I'm so glad and honored to be here. Thank you.
And I'd like to mention that if you're in crisis now, if you need support, if you need a helping hand because you're facing SARA, there are resources to help you. We'll have some of those in the show notes, but there's also the National Domestic Violence Hotline that you can call to reach out if you're experiencing spiritual and ritual abuse in the home. It's 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-7233. Have a great today and a beautiful, safe, supportive tomorrow for our children.